Oh, the college football playoff first round did not end on a high note for the narrative that all the SEC fanboys wanted to run with this upcoming week on ESPN, radio stations across America, social media, message boards everywhere. They did not get what they wanted. And man, I'm here for it. Welcome in. I'm Pete Mundo. Heartland College Sports is where you find us covering the Big 12 Conference. We appreciate you, as always, being a part of the show and making sure you are subscribed to it. Whether it's on YouTube, the podcast, thank you guys for doing that. As always, costs you nothing and a great way to support this show and never miss an episode. So you saw, if you were scrolling through your social media feeds on Saturday afternoon, you saw Lane Kiffin being a big old baby. I'd use another B word, but I don't want to say it. We're a family-friendly show, so he was being a big old baby. You saw some of the usual ESPN talking heads going bonkers about this, that, and the next thing. Oh, it should have been Alabama instead of SMU. It should have been South Carolina. It should have been Ole Miss. You saw all the chatter. Of course, this was one night after Indiana lost at Notre Dame, 27-17 in the first round. And then Texas took care of Clemson. 14-point game there after, of course, SMU got blasted by Penn State. And while the Texas-Clemson game was closer than maybe the final score would indicate, things were going well for those looking to push the narrative. And then came Saturday night. And then came Columbus, Ohio. And who would have thought the highlight for that game for Tennessee would have been when they showed up before the game with their shirts off? Who would have thought that? Man, they were acting so tough. They were ready to put the exclamation point on this day for the narrative that the SEC was the be-all, end-all. The whole thing was going to run through them. It's a joke that Ole Miss, South Carolina, and Alabama, at least two of those three, were not in this college football playoff, and this was going to be the icing on the cake. Until it wasn't. Until Tennessee got run out of the building. And you can tell me all you want about, well, Tennessee scored at the end of the first half, and then they got the ball to start the second half. So you're saying there's a chance. What if they score to start the second half? Then we got a ball game. Oh, my gosh. How many games can you look at and say that? It didn't matter. It was irrelevant when push came to shove. And that was exactly what the rest of college football needed to stop the stupidity that was coming out of social media largely, but also other elements of various cable news operations, sports news operations. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because suddenly it was very silent on Saturday night. The people who were pumping their chests, who were flexing, who were, doing the whole 9 yards, they were suddenly nowhere to be found. Their argument went up in flames, as it should have all along. Okay? And I thought that our good pal Tim Brando said it best. Tim Brando said on Saturday night on X, and Tim and I exchanged text messages about this after the fact, but Tim Brando said here about all the SEC whining and complaining about we need more teams in the playoff. Brando writes, we can always count on Paul Feinbaum to lead the Looney Tunes from Bama and beyond. Paul and I are still friends, I think, but he and some athletic directors, plenty of head coaches like Lane Kiffin at the top of that list, bless his heart, have all embarrassed the South with their whining after nothing but pure playoff privilege in the past. Here's another P word for it, pathetic. Every game played in the new format is a referendum on how poorly the SEC has been treated, and then he uses a facepalm and laughing emoji. That was obviously sarcasm at the end. It's amazing how the SEC is like 1,125-0 in hypothetical games, isn't it? It's pretty incredible. I mean, they are so good in these hypothetical games that never actually get played, that don't actually happen. But somehow, if they had happened, obviously the SEC would win, or the SEC team would win because they have more 4- and 5-star recruits, because that's obviously what it's all about. It's not about teamwork. It's not about development. It's only about those very things. Now, you can make the argument, well, the SEC's won, 14 of 18 national championships. That's all true. No one's ever argued they don't have very high-end talent. An SEC team may end up winning the college football playoff. Would you be surprised if Texas or Georgia end up winning the playoff? I wouldn't be at all. It's never been about the top end in the SEC. It's how good is the middle of the pack? How good is tier 2? And those results have been very mixed. They have been, okay? And you know what? If you're Alabama, don't get smoked by a mediocre at best Oklahoma team by 21. I don't know what else to tell you, right? I really don't know what else you want to know. I don't know what else you want to hear. I don't know what's going to make you feel better. If you're Ole Miss, what do you say to Ole Miss? Don't lose to a Kentucky team that was literally the only win they got in SEC play was against you. That's it. They were 1-7 in the SEC because, remember, they don't play 9 conference games like the big boys do. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but you get the point. I mean, don't lose to Kentucky at home, Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin was tweeting like a madman on Saturday during this playoff. I mean, he was all over the map. On Saturday, Lane Kiffin, head coach at Ole Miss, wrote, "Way to keep us on the edge of our seats, committee, ... riveting." That was during the SMU Penn State game. You know, what's to say that Ole Miss, a team that lost to Kentucky, who went 4-8 and 1-7 in the SEC, was going to suddenly show up and take care of business? You know, they also lost to Florida, who went 8-5 this year and 4-4 in the SEC. Can we not forget about that late in the season as well? LSU is not a bad loss, of course, but you know, look at the numbers. I mean, Ole Miss, if they were as consistent as they were when it comes to Lane Kiffin's tweeting or posting on X, they might be doing a little bit better. They might be in this college football playoff. My goodness. So the whining, the complaining was put to rest because suddenly everybody got real quiet when Tennessee got blown out by Ohio State. And I'll say this, like, I know a lot of people are digging at Paul Feinbaum. Paul's been on this show. I think he's a good guy. Like, I really do. He's going to defend the SEC. He's going to defend Alabama. I get it. I disagree with him vehemently on a lot of that stuff. Not that the SEC is not the best conference. Not that they don't have the best top-end teams. I would argue they do. But the notion that they deserve 6 teams in this playoff or whatever it might be, I do not agree with. But I respect him. He's been a great guest on the show before. I like having him on. I just don't think he's right about this. And I think that whether it's Lane Kiffin, whether it's so many of the others that have been out there complaining. I mean, Kirk Herbstreit was doing some of this as well on Saturday. He said Indiana was outclassed. It was not a team that should have been in that field when you consider other teams that could have been there. Do you value winning or not? Here's the biggest problem right now. And this is what the sport has to figure out. The biggest problem is that there's not consistency across the board. Some conferences play 8 league games, some play 9, right? But then there's also this other issue. With 16 and 18 team conferences, if you get a good draw in your league schedule when you're only playing at most half the conference, well, guess what? The quality of your schedule will dictate how good of a team you actually are. And here's the amazing part. The sport did it to itself out of stupidity and greed. I don't want to hear moaning from the SEC teams. I certainly don't want to hear from Oklahoma and Texas or Missouri or A&M who leave the Big 12, join the SEC for the bag, and then complain that it's too difficult to make the college football playoff. This is what you wanted. If you go back 15 years ago, to the way the conferences were, Pac-12, Big 12, Big 10, SEC, ACC, like 15 years ago, before the A&M, Missouri, Colorado, Nebraska departures, before that batch of realignment, we had 5 very good and very balanced conferences. And if we went back to that, and if everybody played 9 conference games, 1 Power 5, 1 Group of 5, 1 FCS, do you realize how equitable this sport would be right now? and how much easier it would be to determine who the best teams are in the country, it wouldn't be that difficult. It's amazing how this sport did this to itself. Teams did this to themselves. Conferences did this to themselves. And now on the back end, they're complaining about it. You guys can't have it both ways. Okay? And if the SEC wants to branch off and play its little SEC tournament and crown their own champion and call it the national championship, fine, do it. Have fun. The rest of us, I know you don't care, but I think we'll be all right. I actually think you need the rest of us outside of the SEC more than you realize at this point in time. But if that's what you want to do, if that's what's going to make, Greg Sankey sleep well at night, he's going to put his head on that pillow, it's going to be nice and cool, so be it. Do it. I dare you to do it. The sport will destroy itself, and the only reason the sport is where it is because of you and because of me, because of fans, because of people who love the sport by the tens of millions. And you guys will jeopardize that. You will put that at risk by your own narcissistic, egotistical, insane levels of greed. That's what you will risk doing here. If you want to do it, you're playing roulette, but it wouldn't be the first time. But think back to where we were 15 years ago and how you had balance in the conferences that actually would have set up very well for the current structure of a college football playoff. But the sport changed, and the sport changed in large part for the worse. It doesn't mean I don't love the Big 12. I do. I'm here for it. You guys know that every single day. I've covered this conference and loved this conference, and I've owned Heartland College Sports for 10 years now, when it started off as a little blog with like 3 readers. And now between the written, the audio, the visual, we're reaching, millions of people a month because of you guys, because you're sharing content, you're liking this video, you're subscribing to the show, you're doing all these different things. Our radio affiliates out there, everybody's doing their part. But my gosh, the people in charge are doing their best to try to absolutely destroy it. And it's so sad to see. And it didn't need to be this way. But since the SEC in large part wanted it to be this way, now you want us to feel bad for you? No. I am hoping like heck that we get quarterfinal games. I mean, how good would it be to see Notre Dame beat Georgia? I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying that would feel good. To have an semifinal with no SEC teams in it, I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying. Texas is playing Arizona State, and Arizona State's a 2-touchdown underdog in that game. So before we get to that, I also want to point out something that people are saying in regards to how these games were not competitive and how if only more SEC teams were in it, it would have been competitive. By the way, I'm Pete Mundo. We're Heartland College Sports. Thanks for being here. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. As always, costs you nothing, helps us out a lot, keeps you posted on our videos. So the average margin of victory in these first-round games was 19.2 points. Not good. Not exactly competitive. But how unique is that, generally speaking? Well, it's not all that unique. So I went back and I looked at the first 8 years of the college football playoff. When it started back in 2014, the first 8 years of the college football playoff, that's 16 semifinal games, were decided by an average of 21 points. You heard that right. 16 games, big sample size, first 8 years of the college football playoff. The semifinals had an average margin of victory of 21 points. Now, the last 2 years have been very competitive. The last 2 years, we've seen semifinal games decided by an average of 5 points. Michigan beat Alabama last year in overtime. Washington handled Texas. And then the year prior was TCU beating Michigan and Georgia slipping by Ohio State 42-41. But the first 8 years, we're now on year 11, just total blowouts. Average margin of victory of 21 points. So why should you be surprised? Why are we surprised when the first ever 12-team playoff results in a lot of blowouts? I'm not shocked by it. I mean, the spreads were all pretty big on these games. I don't think any of us thought the average margin would be 19 points, but still. Am I stunned? No. And neither should you. Now, what about the NFL? I mean, go back to the NFL playoffs, the wild card round, the first round of the NFL playoffs. Last year, wild card weekend had an average margin of victory of 17.3 points. Other than the Lions beating the Rams 24-23, the other 5 games were decided by at least 14 points. 2 years ago, the NFL playoffs wildcard weekend was competitive. Average margin of victory, 7.1 points, much better. But you go back 3 years, 2021, 2022 NFL playoffs, wildcard weekend had an average margin of victory of 17 points. So to note and act like blowouts in the first round of the playoffs, now that we have 12 teams in the playoff, is somehow justification for jamming in more SEC teams. Why? It happens in the NFL. The semifinals were blowouts for the first 8 years in college football. This is not a surprise. Now, if there's one change that needs to happen as soon as possible, it's this. Not giving buys based on conference victories. I've been saying this for weeks because let's be honest, Texas, which lost the SEC championship, has an easier path than Georgia. And Oregon, who won the Big Ten, has a harder path than Penn State. Penn State gets Boise State. Oregon gets Ohio State. Who would you rather be? I'd rather be Penn State going up against Boise. And with all due respect to Arizona State, who you know I'm pulling for as a Big 12 guy, I'd rather be Texas playing Arizona State than Georgia playing Notre Dame. I'd love to be proven wrong. But here's the conundrum for the entire sport of college football. If you do that, what does it do to championship weekend that is becoming more and more of a dud? You could get into the Big Ten championship game between Oregon and Penn State for $10. The Arizona State-Iowa State Big 12 championship game cost you $12. I looked it up on StubHub the day of. If you get rid of the automatic bids, if you get rid of the buys, or I should say the buys, not the automatic bids, if you get rid of the buys, then you've got yourself a problem because that gives people incentive to win that conference championship game. There will be years, it wouldn't have been this year in the Big 12, but there will be years that if a team is 11-1 and they know they're in the playoff, win or lose, what's the point in playing in that conference championship game? Maybe you get a bye. Likely it doesn't matter. And for a sport that wants to continue a championship weekend, at least I think it does, then that puts it in a very difficult spot moving forward. And it's why they've got to figure out what to do. I mean, I'm at the point where I'd expand to 16 and blow out the conference championship weekend. Just have that championship weekend be 1v16, 2v15, and just stack them up. Home field, on campus. Play Army-Navy the following Saturday if you want. You could still do quarterfinals around Army-Navy, but if you want to leave it standalone, then quarterfinals would be this weekend. And once again, I'd do quarterfinals on campus. 8 games left, quarterfinals on campus, or 8 teams left, not 8 games, 8 teams left, quarterfinals on campus, and then you have the semifinals at the neutral site, New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, whatever, and a national championship in mid-January. That's fine. I wouldn't end it on January 20th. That's insane. I'd end it right around January 10th, ideally on a Saturday. I mean, that's when the sport is played. But I'll save that rant for another day. That's how this thing has to be fixed, and it has to be fixed in a big way because Penn State and Texas are massive favorites in their quarterfinals games. They didn't win the SEC championship or the Big Ten championship. The teams that won it have tougher draws and are much smaller favorites. That's a problem for the sport. And now that leaves us with Arizona State. Arizona State is the team that is going to be potentially carrying the Big 12 and the ACC the rest of the way. I'm Pete Mundo. We're Heartland College Sports. Thanks for being here, as always, as a part of the show. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that the ACC teams are out. Clemson lost to Texas, and SMU lost to Penn State. Now, you might say, what about Notre Dame? Okay, Notre Dame is not an ACC team. Notre Dame has that blue blood privilege that supersedes any conference affiliation that they have. I don't think Notre Dame deep down really views itself as an ACC team. Yeah, they've got the little scheduling partnership, but outside of that, you really think Notre Dame is going around bragging about being in the ACC to anybody? They don't. They're not an ACC team. So every ACC fan and Big 12 fan has to be rooting for Arizona State. And to a lesser extent, Notre Dame. Because they're the teams going up against the mighty SEC programs that can do no harm. That is who they're going up against. But if Arizona State gets its doors blown off by Texas, the argument is going to only continue from the SEC media and the SEC fanboys. And that is going to be the Big 12 arguably had maybe no business being in this thing, certainly had no business having a bye. And they will shake this thing up as quickly as they can. They will continue towards consolidation. That narrative is largely riding on Arizona State coming up in a week and a half. I don't want to put more pressure on you, Kenny Dillingham. I'm just noting that is a tremendous, tremendous amount of responsibility that Arizona State is carrying into this game because of the way that Clemson and SMU got beat on Saturday. Now, I know Tennessee lost, and obviously we talked about that on this show, but Tennessee did lose to, a team that most people think is a top 3 talent program in the country right now in Ohio State. Arizona State has to, at the very least, play with Texas. And if they don't, we are going to have an offseason all about SEC, to a lesser extent, Big Ten. Nobody else is worthy of our stature, so we've got to figure out the best way forward for this sport. And it will also neuter Brett Yormark in any kind of conversations, and Jim Phillips out of the ACC in any kind of conversations about how the postseason looks in college football. I don't want to overstate it. I really don't think I am, though. That's how important this game is. And then you factor in new Big 12 versus old Big 12. I mean, my gosh. Even OU fans are going to be rooting for their old conference here in this game, right? You've got the Cinderella story in Arizona State, the team that was picked to finish dead last in the Big 12 in the preseason media poll, now sitting there in the college football playoff, getting set to take on the Texas Longhorns, who a lot of people had in their top 2, 3, 4, 5 in the preseason. Texas is where everybody thought they were going to be. Arizona State is where nobody thought they were going to be. So now you've got all this riding on this game. And like I said, a lesser extent Notre Dame, because Notre Dame is always going to kind of be its own entity. They really don't represent the ACC and that entire conference. They play a handful of games, but nothing more. If Arizona State loses by 30 points to Texas, that is a worst-case scenario for the Big 12 and for the ACC. But I think Arizona State's going to be up to the task. I do. I think the rest will matter. And I'm not predicting anything right now. We'll get to predictions and whatnot in the next, week and a half or so before the game. I promise you. I will give you every Big 12 bowl game previewed and picked. I will do every single one of them. I'm 1-0 so far. I ticked off a lot of people when I, told you that I did not think that West Virginia was going to win or cover the spread against Memphis, but I was right on that one. So far, so good. I hit the Big 12 championship game. I picked Arizona State to win and cover that spread as well. So we're on a little bit of a roll here as we get into the postseason. I will give you all of those picks in the days ahead. Another reason you got to be subscribed here on HeartlandCollegeSports.com, where we cover the Big 12 Conference on YouTube, on the podcast, and also find us on the free Heartland College Sports forums. I'm just pointing this out, that this is not just a college football playoff quarterfinal game. It is a college football playoff quarterfinal game that will largely determine the offseason conversation for the entire sport. And that is why this game is so important, not just on the field, but also off the field. Pete Mundo on Heartland College Sports. Thank you guys for being here. It's all good. I like this on YouTube from Double O'Neill. More football equals life is better. Arguing for less is stupid. There's an element to that, my man, that I think is important to note. And I'm glad you said it. Because you know what? You're right. This past weekend, typically on the college football calendar, is dead. There's nothing. There's maybe a couple of garbage bowl games. Okay, the games weren't great, but guess what? We got meaningful college football, and I enjoyed it. I did. I didn't watch every game start to finish because there was no Big 12 team in it, but I was in, I was out. I had the Chiefs on. Obviously, I'm here in Kansas City, so I was watching that game against the Texans on Saturday. But we had meaningful, great atmospheres on campus in a college football playoff. I don't mind it one bit. I'm not arguing against that at all. That was never part of the show, never part of the conversation. I'm not saying you said it was. I'm just noting that. I'm with you there. We had really good theoretical matchups. They didn't pan out that way. And we're on the quarterfinals, which are going to be a heck of a lot of fun. All right? Let's see how it plays out. Thank you, guys. We appreciate you as always. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll talk to you soon. I'm Pete Mundo, Heartland College Sports. Go Big 12. Have a great day.